Peace be upon you, friends. I am your friend Aram. This is my first video on the channel. Please support my channel by subscribing. In this channel, I list a group of novels, and this is the first part of one of the beautiful novels. This novel, or autobiography, or as we will agree to classify it later, is not to classify one group of society or isolate one group over others. Although classification is important in my society and one of the most important initial credentials before accepting your opinion or even accepting to hear it. You must have a classification or rank to be achieved, on the basis of which you evaluate your mind, thought, or experiences. Hey, I was born in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the mid-70s, 7 years after my mother and father's marriage. I was a source of joy and delight for them and for the whole family, and as my mother told me, I was born smiling and did not cry when I was born. Before I completed my first year, I traveled with them to the United States of America, when my father decided to complete his studies to obtain a master's degree. Oh, I grew up in an environment completely different from the environment to which I will return later after my father finished his studies. I grew up in a Western environment and learned English before Arabic, and it became my first language. I lived like any Western child, living his daily life under the shadow of the largest capitalist country in the world. I started in nursery school, then kindergarten. I ate fast food from McDonald's and other famous American restaurants, and I visited the magical world of Disney. Oh, I was still a 4-year-old child, and I did not realize until later that I was armed with intellectual tools that would later in my life give me the biggest window into a world that some still call to this day the world of infidelity and hateful immorality. After nearly 5 years had passed, we returned with my father to his hometown after he finished his studies and obtained a master's degree. This coincided with the birth of my only brother, who held American citizenship because he was born there. I returned to a world and a culture that I knew nothing about. I returned and I was not even fluent in one of the languages spoken by those around me. I was like a stranger who came from another planet. He used to put me in gatherings to speak to people in this strange language that they had only heard from television, in Western movies and series, and which many adults were not fluent in. It was strange for them to see a 5-year-old child speaking it fluently, and I clearly remembered that whenever I spoke, I would laugh. It was all over the place, and I did not know why. I do not remember it out of arrogance or arrogance, but it was a feeling of not belonging that stuck with me, especially in the first days of my return to the country. The most common question I was asked was, "What is your name?" There were looks of dissatisfaction from some of those attending these gatherings, because I was speaking in the language of the infidels according to their point of view, and they were not hiding that dissatisfaction by alerting my father as if I was about to deviate from the straight path. But praise be to God, my father was not one of the people who fights what they do not know or is flattering about their principles. He raised me to do that, so he ignored those comments and did not meet. She cares. Within months, I learned Arabic through practice and listening, but I did not forget my first language, and I was very eager to hear and practice that language, with which I lived and through which I lived the beautiful days of my childhood. The first way I returned to that world that I longed for was by watching the Aramco channel, which was dedicated to the employees of the Arab American Oil Company, which was later called the Saudi Oil Company Aramco. It was broadcast from Dhahran, the eastern province, and was directed to Americans and foreigners as a form of therapy. Because of their homesickness, I was among those who were homesick and followed that channel. That channel was a window through which I looked every day into my world, from which I had left without warning. I would follow it until it closed at night. It was as if upon my return from abroad to my homeland, The process of installing that culture in my mind had stopped, and the installation resumed after I followed the channel and its programs centered around my culture, the first. I was never attracted to the local culture, not out of hatred for it or arrogance over it, but it was more like an urgent instinct towards the other culture, just like a child who has discovered after what he lived and was raised by his mother until he reached the age of 5. From his age, he learned that he was adopted, and that his real mother who gave birth to him was coming to take him into the arms of his first mother. So he began to cry because of separation from the one who raised him when he was young, not out of hatred for his real or biological mother, but rather out of attachment to his mother who raised him, embraced him, and was with him in his first steps in this world. Aramco Channel programs were like a photo album of that mother who raised me, which was torn from her chest after I became familiar with it and became emotionally and mentally attached to it. I used to browse that album every day, and I longed to see her, even if that mother was non-Muslim and wore a cross. Therefore, many people do not understand me today when I defend my first mother, or my first culture, so to speak, which they always describe as immorality and debauchery on every occasion. Who among us would be satisfied with that? His mother curses in front of him, and he stands silent and still as he hears those accusing her of the most horrific accusations and descriptions, even if some of them are true. Therefore, I defended it in many discussions despite the descriptions that were attached to me for doing so. The day I discovered reading, the television broke down. I was about 10 years old, and at that crucial moment in my life, I felt lost and felt that my sight had been taken away from me, because I was not like the other children who eagerly played ball in the street or rode their bikes, moving from one alley to another, gathering their experiences from life through practice, and direct interaction with their peers. I had my own world, which was disturbed and disrupted by the malfunction of that television. I went to my father to ask him to fix the television to restore my only window to the world to what it was before, because I was on my first day, and after the end of my school day, the television was like a magic box that provided me with doses of suspense and excitement, which I always longed for because at that time I did not have a hobby to entertain myself with. With it or I kill my free time, which was and still is a vessel that quickly empties, and my obsession is always filling it. Despite his quick response, I was disappointed when I learned after my father returned in the evening that the device would remain for 3 days to be repaired. I developed a strong curiosity that day to occupy my time with something alternative until my window returned to its normal state. I began searching around the house in order to perhaps find something to entertain me during those 3 lonely days. The search led me to the upper floor of our house, and from there I headed to a room that I had never thought of entering, my father's library. I cannot describe my feeling that day when I opened the library door, but it was more like someone discovering a buried treasure in his yard. The treasure was a collection of books, magazines, tapes, and documents that my father had collected during his years of study in America. They were all lined up in a huge glass cupboard and arranged very carefully. The reading table was like the ones you find in meeting rooms, with a globe on top of it and a real leather wheelchair in its center. I felt that the world was in my hands, and even though the books, magazines, and tapes were all in English, I learned from them with passion and loved reading and listening to the songs of singers of the 60s and 70s, such as the Beatles, the Bee Gees, and Boney M. While I was browsing through my first copy of Time magazine, I was There I Am Here. In that library, I found the magic carpet that wrapped the world around me using pages of paper and through some musical melodies that took me to my first culture in seconds. I felt lucky because most children my age would not have benefited from this great treasure without the language I had, the cultural and intellectual preparation instilled in me, and the freedom I was given to browse that library. I finished reading my first encyclopedia in a few days when I was just a 10-year-old child and delved into sciences that I did not understand at the time because my father loved to acquire books in all fields and had a special collection locked in a black diplomatic bag that I was obliged to open later after several months. The television came home after the 3 days had passed, and I did not pay any attention to it as before. I found what was richer and richer, so I navigated the surroundings of that library without stopping until I graduated from primary school. At that time, I did not find the school curricula attractive, which had an adverse effect on the level of my academic achievement. I wasn't stupid, but I wasn't interested. I did not have many friends at that stage of my life, not because I was an introvert, but I was not attracted to children my age, as their topics were far removed from the topics that might stimulate my slightest interest, and I saw their interests as very superficial, despite my repeated attempts to integrate with them. At that stage, I began reading local literature, but it also did not attract me due to the difference in style and strength in presentation from its counterparts on the Western side. But literature attracted me, and I read a lot for my longing. I do not know why, but he is the poet who caught my attention the most and attracted me to what he wrote. Days passed, and I lived with a different mind than those around me, not necessarily smarter, but certainly different. My daily and continuous reading of these books in my father's library was a major factor in the crystallization of my personality and the occurrence of what resembled early puberty in my mind. I loved analyzing characters because there were many and diverse samples around me. I remember when I was about 12 years old, I was suffering from a stomach problem. This pain was recurring, and all the doctors and consultants that my father took me to did not find a cure. Because of my mother's concern for me, and the failure of modern medicine to provide a solution to my chronic condition, my mother decided to go to a sheikh, who specializes in reading on the people, and even though my mother would not have knocked on this unknown door or thought about it, this is not denial of the Quran and its ability, God willing, to heal people, but rather doubt and distrust of those who practice reading. But in the end, she submitted to the pressure, insistence, and high recommendations of her relatives against this honorable sheikh. We went out with my father after my mother's insistence and went to a person who was called the Omani Sheikh to start treatment sessions with him. My father used to drive us to an area with mud houses, so my mother and I would walk the rest of the distance through old, dilapidated houses, which was a new environment for me at that time.